So good afternoon, shalom, welcome everybody to the department seminar of Bar Ilan University. We are honored today to host Professor Jeffrey Epst. He is a professor emeritus at Wayne State University. Prior to that, he worked at the Special Collections Research Center, University of Chicago, and Chicago's Smart Museum of Art. An artist and writer, his artwork is in several museums and collections. His books include American Egyptologist and Valuing Detroit's Art Museum. He co-edited and is on the editorial board of the Museum History Journal. Today, he will talk about the Jewish Museum of New York's exhibits in the 60s. And without further ado, please, Jeffrey, the floor is yours. And thank you for being with us today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you, Marianne, for handling all of these arrangements and for more also for your assistance. And thank all of you for tuning in today. I'm going to take a moment and switch to screen share so you can see my images. And okay, there we go. In discussing my book today, I will focus on one of its through lines, the beliefs of the Jewish Museum's backers, all Jews and many of whom were collectors, about what the museum ought to exhibit and why. A story that unfolds during the 1950s and 1960s, a period of great change in New York's art world and Jewish community. Informing those beliefs were differing perceptions of the museum's public and the prevailing religious, social, and cultural needs of the day, all conditioned by differing understandings of Jewish identity as well. My talk takes a little bit less than 50 minutes, so hopefully we'll have some time for comments and questions afterwards. And I'd be happy to linger on Zoom after that, even if people would like to chat. Although the Jewish Museum dates its origins to a founding donation of ritual objects in 1904, they began earlier with the work and family connections of Cyrus Adler. Born in 1863, he was an influential leader who began his career as a curator of Middle Eastern antiquities at the Smithsonian Institution. Among his tasks was organizing displays on the history of religions for World's Fairs across the United States, including the Smithsonian's contributions to the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. To do so, Adler placed the ritual objects of Judaism alongside those of Christianity, Islam, and other religions. Underlying his approach may have been an unspoken desire to combat anti-Semitism, inspired in part by the 1887 Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition mounted by London's Jewish community. Significantly, Adler's approach required acquisition of Jewish ritual objects for the Smithsonian. During this time, Adler commuted weekly to New York to teach a course on biblical archaeology at the forerunner of today's Jewish Theological Seminary. It soon foundered, however, and Adler helped lead its revitalization. This included acquiring materials to expand the seminary's library. That effort was supported by Meyer Sulzberger of Philadelphia, with donations of books and manuscripts, all encouraged by Adler. Meyer's father, David Sulzberger, was Adler's uncle, and he raised Adler after his father's death. Adler later persuaded both Sulzbergers to donate over 20 objects for the Smithsonian's Judaica collection. So it was, in 1904, that Meyer Sulzberger donated to the seminary a number of ritual objects to, quote, serve as a suggestion for the establishment of a Jewish museum, thereby seeding the institution we're exploring today. Adler later became the seminary president, and under his leadership, it and its artifacts collection steadily grew. Some objects were displayed in glass table cases in the library's reading room. That growth prompted expansion plans that included a larger library, now with a dedicated museum space, funded by Mortimer Schiff and Felix M. Warburg. Schiff, like his father Jacob Schiff, was a New York financier and philanthropist, and Warburg, scion of the Warburg banking dynasty, was also a New York investment banker and a, quote, one-man social welfare agency. Warburg and Schiff were linked by marriage as well as philanthropy. Warburg married Jacob Schiff's daughter, Frida. Warburg's 1920s purchase of a collection of over 60 ritual objects for the seminary museum was in fact regarded by Adler as the actual origin of the museum, and its new setting, Warburg's brainchild. Located in the new library, it opened in 1931 and was named the Museum of Jewish Ceremonial and Historical Objects, reflecting Adler's emphasis on Jewish religion and history. Between 1932 and 1945, the museum presented 45 exhibits. Its collection grew to nearly 2,300 objects, and its annual attendance rose to the low 20,000s. Adler died in 1940, however, and Louis Finkelstein succeeded him. Finkelstein earned degrees at the City College of New York and Columbia University while concurrently studying at the seminary, where he was ordained in 1919. Finkelstein envisioned a larger role for Judaism in American public affairs by promoting understanding among various faiths and showing how Judaism's teachings were indispensable to American democracy. Among his initiatives was a program fostering intergroup dialogue among religious scholars and leaders from different religions. But the most popular of Finkelstein's outreach efforts were media broadcasts. In 1944, he launched radio series dramatizing the experiences of Jews during and after the Holocaust, Jewish contributions to American society and culture, and Jewish folklore and literature. The longest-running series was The Eternal Light, which, over its nearly 45 years, produced almost 1,900 episodes. They were broadcast by over 100 stations, including the U.S. Armed Forces Radio and The Voice of America, reaching nearly 6 million listeners per show. Finkelstein's outreach efforts vaulted him to national prominence and the cover of the leading news weekly of the day, Time. A few years after Finkelstein became seminary president, Frida Schiff Warburg donated her mansion for the museum's new home. With its imposing exterior and ornate interiors, and its setting on Fifth Avenue near the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the mansion would elevate the seminary museum's visibility. Frida was a seminary trustee, and the donation honored the Warburgs and Schiff's prior contributions. But the mansion had to be renovated for its museum functions, and Finkelstein appointed a committee of art museum professionals and historians to recommend the necessary changes. Being oriented toward the visual arts, the committee thought of the museum's collections in aesthetic rather than historical or religious terms, however, and initially suggested its name be changed from Museum of Jewish Ceremonial and Historical Objects to something like Museum of Jewish Art. The historians on the planning committee were Richard Krautheimer, Guido Schoenberger, and Meyer Shapiro. Krautheimer, born, educated, and employed in Germany, emigrated to America in 1935. His dissertation was on medieval synagogue architecture, but he moved on to other topics. Schoenberger, also from Germany, was educated and worked there until he lost his position when the Nazis came to power. He was hired by Frankfurt's Jewish Antiquities Museum, becoming one of the era's first few art historians researching Jewish ritual objects. before immigrating to America in 1939. Meyer Shapiro, later the museum's lead advisor, was born in Lithuania, but raised in America under the influence of the Jewish Enlightenment and the Socialist Jewish Bund. Shapiro imbibed those values, translating them into a lifelong commitment to Enlightenment values of rationalism over religion, egalitarianism, and social activism. Shapiro's scholarship ranged from Romanesque sculpture to avant-garde art, the most challenging artistic explorations of his time. Schoenberger inaugurated the committee's discussions with a plan for a, quote, museum of Jewish culture. He emphasized the history of Jewish cultural life, by which he meant an amalgam of Jews' religious beliefs, practices, and, quote, historical mission. Krauthammer agreed with most of Schoenberger's suggestions, but regarding the institution's name, still preferred Museum of Jewish Art. Yet, the potential meanings of Jewish gave him pause, however, if it were construed as something like a Jewish race. The museum would be limited to showing only objects by Jews, whether the works in question possessed any specific Jewish qualities. For example, a French landscape by Jewish impressionist Camille Pissarro. If, on the other hand, the term referred to religion only, ritual objects would be featured, while works created for Jews' secular use might be excluded. Krauthammer urged Jewish be understood as, quote, a collective unit, whether religious or secular, because both were often intertwined in Jewish history. He was also skeptical of the term art because he thought the number of truly artistic Jewish works was too limited and their quality was rarely outstanding. Instead, he wanted to focus on the visual, that is, representing Jewish life in visual form by featuring aesthetically interesting objects, even if they did not rise to the level of high art. Eventually, a consensus was achieved by foregrounding the modern Jewish experience and featuring visual expressions of Judaism, even if the new institution was not to be called a, quote, museum of art. In the meantime, Stephen S. Kaiser was chosen to head the new museum. He, too, was born, educated, and worked in Germany before fleeing to America in 1938. He served brief stints at a few universities or their libraries, including Columbia Universities, where he met Shapiro, who recommended Kaiser for the museum post. Significantly, Shapiro helped Kaiser narrow the museum's visual culture emphasis to art and then to modern art. Finkelstein endorsed the changes and the museum's new name as well. It would be the Jewish Museum with the tag under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the name it retains to this day, and a moniker that obscured its new mission as an art museum. Kaiser opened the museum's inaugural exhibition in 1947. Presented on the first floor, it consisted of works by a variety of contemporary Jewish artists, from social realists to abstract expressionists. And unfortunately, there are no photos of that exhibition that survive. The permanent collection, on the other hand, was installed on the museum's second floor, adjacent to temporary displays illustrating Jewish holidays, a Sabbath Eve installation of a presumably representative dining room, and a synagogue-like gallery. Ideally, the works by contemporary Jewish artists were selected to represent, quote, Jewish themes or sentiment. But that was not a requirement, telegraphing an openness to all kinds of art, identifiably Jewish or not. Kaiser anticipated the abstract art would not, quote, please everybody. He thought that absence of Jewish subject matter, such as bearded rabbis or biblical scenes, reflected the frailty of faith among contemporary Jews. Quote, the security of olden days is gone, and the artist cannot restore it. Kaiser was well aware of the flowering in nature of Jewish art following European emancipation in the 19th century, what Richie Cohen called a visual revolution in Jewish life. Not only had Jews gained the freedom and means to express themselves artistically, it also allowed many to pursue audiences outside the Jewish community by creating artworks that visually had nothing to do with Judaism. With those works came, as you well know, the vexed question of what qualified as Jewish art. While it was easy enough to discern the characteristics of Jewishness in ritual objects, related folk arts, or images depicting Jewish themes, it was not so obvious in works created by Jewish artists when they explored matters not visibly Jewish. For the Jewish Museum, Kaiser wondered, would it be acceptable to display works without visible Jewish content, whether by Jewish or non-Jewish artists, if they were nonetheless meaningful for Jewish curators or collectors? Though seemingly theoretical, Kaiser's questions foreshadowed the very issues instantiated by the Jewish Museum, as it shifted from an emphasis on displaying ritual objects to one on exploring modern art. The new museum attracted over 100,000 visitors during its first 7 months, and Kaiser's modern art program was indeed criticized. Finkelstein fielded one complaint, replying that contemporary art exhibits are, quote, always controversial, but added that many people commended the exhibits, finding the museum, quote, what the eternal light is to its listening audience. Shapiro, for his part, urged the Jewish community to be more open-minded about modern art. Because of the Jews', quote, historic place in world culture, he argued, they ought to embrace the work of Jewish avant-garde artists for the Jewish and, quote, universally human values they expressed. Further, Shapiro suggested, even though modern art was symptomatic of a secular age, it might nonetheless encourage Jews to appreciate it as, quote, the spiritual element in secular life. During the museum's first decade in its new home, Kaiser mounted nearly 40 exhibitions, of which almost 30 featured living Jewish artists. The museum marked its 10th year there in 1957 with 3 exhibitions, one of Old Master paintings, one of ritual objects, and another of avant-garde art. The latter, titled the New York School Second Generation, was organized by Shapiro. Most of the work by Jewish and non-Jewish artists lacked any visible Jewish content and included the most cutting-edge work of the time. Where the museum's other 2 anniversary exhibits turned to the past, this one looked to the future. The New York School was a triumph. It garnered favorable reviews, a large crowd for the opening, and in the following weeks, the museum was crowded by, quote, arty young people who would sit for hours in front of one picture discussing its significance. A seminary staff member declared the exhibit a success, and all hoped the New York School heralded a new kind of community service the museum might now offer. The exhibit appeared at a time when New York had supplanted Paris as the international capital of modern art. The growth of a network of wealthy collectors of modernist art in New York helped accelerate that transition from European origins to an American homegrown culture. The institutions that fostered that shift, however, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Guggenheim Museum, were now perceived as mired in the past. The art world acclaim for the New York School exhibit thus reflected both an unmet demand for seeing the latest in contemporary art and the Jewish Museum's potential for satisfying it. Doing so meant concentrating on modern art exhibits that, as Kaiser put it, conveyed, quote, themes of universal interest rather than of an exclusively Jewish nature. Though we continued to arrange daring shows of abstract expressionist art, such as one of work by Adolf Gottlieb, they all featured works by Jewish artists. Jewish collectors, however, inspired by the avant-garde, pressed the museum to go further. Elvin Toffler observed at the time that, quote, among the new American collectors and patrons were a number of wealthy Jews who came to the art world in search of an avenue of spiritual adventure, social mobility, and financial investment. The participation of Jews in modern art collecting, especially of works by non-Jewish artists or without Jewish content, began occurring with ever greater frequency in late 19th century Europe and America. The topic and its relation to the development of modern art institutions on both sides of the Atlantic has led to difficult issues that Jewish identity raises concerning the roles of Jewish collectors, scholars, museum professionals, and dealers in the history of modern art. One example is the not uncommon notion that pursuing innovative art was a way for Jews to resolve the paradox of not quite belonging to a sphere of society that they aspired to join, the community of non-Jewish collectors and tradition-bound museums of their time. Yet the collectors and museum leaders most closely associated with the Jewish Museum during the late 1950s and 1960s could be seen as complicating that story. If there was a feeling of not quite belonging for Jewish advocates of the avant-garde during that period, some nonetheless came to own or lead as much as a third of New York's commercial art galleries. Because of their interests, Jewish collectors and museum professionals were as likely to be regarded more skeptically by fellow Jews who disliked avant-garde art than by the non-Jews of New York's art world who enthusiastically welcomed it. Meanwhile, American Jews had so eagerly taken to the cultural explosion of the post-Second World War period that Jewish leaders complained arts interests were diverting money and attention from traditional Jewish causes. When Jews began serving on the boards of cultural institutions such as symphonies, operas, and museums, Jewish welfare institutions ceased to be, quote, the main channel for upward social mobility and high communal visibility. By the mid-1960s, Jews constituted a proportionally higher segment of the culture-producing and consuming public, becoming a significant presence in America's art world as critics, collectors, philanthropists, museum heads, dealers, and, of course, as artists. The phenomenon was a byproduct of other social trends, including assimilation, rising wealth, and an increasing measure of security that enabled Jews not only to participate in, but also begin leading American cultural institutions outside the Jewish community. Exemplary of these changes was Vera List. Whoops, I've got to go back. Just stop my share for a second here while I go back. One slide. There we go. Sorry. Sometimes my computer is a little slow to change the slides. There we go. There's Vera. Vera List was an increasingly prominent collector and cultural activist. She, alongside her husband, Albert A. List, an industrialist and financier, built a fortune they shared via major gifts to New York's Lincoln Center, the New School for Social Research, MIT, and the Jewish Theological Seminary. The List Seminary donations prompted Finkelstein to coax Albert onto the seminary's board of trustees and Vera onto the museum's board. Vera soon began urging the museum to make more of an impact on the art scene and to serve, quote, the whole community, meaning non-Jews as well. List felt that, quote, as a Jew living today, she was also, quote, interested in contemporary art, whoever did it, Catholic, Protestant, Jew. It was also the aesthetic value that she held paramount and how she, quote, reacted to it as a human being. After all, Jews are human and non-Jews are also human. And what counted most was man's urge to express, a trait that is universal and has meaning. Although she knew the museum had successfully, quote, reflected the life of the Jews, say in 17th century Italy, she felt that, quote, the Jewish Museum in 1950, 1960, 1970 should reflect the life of the Jew in the present. Liszt and her husband sweetened her advocacy by donating an edition for the Jewish Museum. Another collector with strongly held views, but his preferences were quite different from Liszt, was Abram Kanoff. He was born in Russia and raised in a religiously observant home, coming to America at a young age. He earned a bachelor's degree at Columbia University, served in the US Navy during the Second World War, and became a pediatrician. In the 1940s, Kanoff and his wife began collecting paintings by early 20th century American artists, and later Yiddish theater and film posters from the late 19th to mid-20th centuries. Soon, Finkelstein appointed Kanoff to the Seminary Trustees Museum Subcommittee and later to head the museum's board, sometime prior to Liszt's joining it. During this period, Kanoff also began collecting Jewish ritual objects, and subsequently he and his wife donated funds to establish a workshop housed in the museum's basement, where the crafting of modern Jewish ritual objects was supported and taught. Later, they contributed an acquisition fund to acquire the best of the workshop's output for the museum's collection. Around this time, Kaiser announced his departure, and the search for his successor prompted a review of the museum's mission. As those discussions proceeded, Kanoff represented, quote, the traditional view of Jewish ceremonial objects as an art, and Liszt, quote, very much involved with the Museum of Modern Art and new trends in the art world, advocated contemporary art. The differences between the two were likened to a Janus-faced creature, quote, hopelessly divided between the Jewish and the secular, and in their differences as representing the kaleidoscope of forces in Jewish life. Ellen Solomon, of Jewish descent, was selected in 1962 to succeed Kaiser. Solomon had taught at Cornell University, where he established and directed the university's art museum, and he was conversant with the newest developments in avant-garde art. The debate about the museum's mission was still underway when Solomon arrived. He tried to help, observing to Liszt, Kanoff, and the others that, quote, the modern emancipated Jew is a heterogeneous figure, unlike his predecessor in the ghetto, whose limited experiences would have resulted in a narrower conception of the museum's purpose. For Solomon, the board's conflicting views reflected the heterogeneity of modern Jewry, and for that reason, there was not a right or wrong position for it to take. Rather, he advised, the members should determine arbitrarily whatever policy decision suited them as the principles concerned, without attempting to rationalize them. Being modern Jews, their beliefs were sufficient justification, ipso facto, and the resulting program would thereby be a legitimate expression of modern Judaism. As a result, the group committed the museum to, quote, significant examples of fine and applied arts, both of the past and contemporary, having significant relation to Jewish life, traditions, literature, and spiritual values. While the museum would continue its Judaica program, it would also display artworks which, quote, shed light on the Jewish contribution to art, that is, not only works by Jewish artists, which reflect the artist's heritage, but also those by others, which relate to Judaism by virtue of their subject or point of view. Strikingly, the mission was expanded to include, quote, works which have appealed to the Jewish collector as giving aesthetic expression to the central ideals of Judaism, including contemporary art. In pursuit of those goals, Solomon found models in the 92nd Street Young Men's Hebrew Association, today's 92nd Street Y, the New School for Social Research, Commentary Magazine, and Finkelstein's outreach programs. The New School at the time was a progressive higher education institution where contemporary art figured prominently. As one scholar observed, both the Y and the New School exemplified ways of, quote, expressing one's Jewishness through the contemporary arts as an acceptable way of being Jewish in America. Commentary Magazine was then an influential platform featuring leading New York intellectuals and focusing on the most urgent political and cultural issues of the day. Commentary aspired to be, quote, both Jewish and non-parochial, thus making it, quote, a vehicle for exploring new forms of Jewishness. Solomon opened the museum's edition in 1963. It relocated the museum's entrance to the Fifth Avenue side and provided an entrance lobby, large gallery, and gift shop on the first floor. The second floor was a bigger gallery, at the time one of the largest in New York. He inaugurated the new space with a ritual objects exhibit and another of depictions based on the Hebrew Bible. They were followed by the first museum survey of works by Robert Rauschenberg, a 37-year-old non-Jewish artist. He was considered among the precursors of the newest tendencies in modern art, his work exemplifying the qualities Solomon wanted to feature in the museum's avant-garde exhibits. The show's opening was characterized as the first of the wide-open, see and be seen roaring art world galas that became such a part of the 60s scene. Many young artists came, and the, quote, still somewhat unfamiliar Swedish smell of marijuana hung in the air as the museum's regulars gazed with amazement at the mass of disheveled art lovers. The exhibition not only boosted Rauschenberg's renown, it also attracted far more attention to the Jewish Museum than it had ever known before. The next in Solomon's avant-garde program, Black and White, featured works by several artists whose paintings reflected a trend in American visual culture, one vividly captured by a Look magazine photo shoot in the museum. These and other avant-garde exhibits, like a survey by another rising star, Jasper Johns, boosted the museum's annual attendance from an average of about 88,000 during Kaiser's time to well over 130,000. Though popular in the art world, they attracted criticism from the Jewish community because the artists weren't Jewish and the works shown seemed far removed from Judaism. A seminary official, on Finkelstein's behalf, tried to assuage a rabbi's concern by arguing that, quote, Jews in our country have been in the forefront of many new and exciting developments in all fields. Meyer Shapiro lent his support, arguing that, quote, a Jewish museum of art can no more limit itself to the work of Jewish artists than a Jewish university to the intellectual achievements of Jewish scholars and scientists. It is through the parallel to Jewish colleges, hospitals, and cultural centers that one should understand the museum's avant-garde program. Ben Heller, a prominent businessman and collector who had joined the museum's board by then, was more circumspect. He tried to reconcile the museum's aim of doing both, quote, those things which we call Judaica and, quote, those things which we call contemporary, with how the, quote, alert, intellectual, sensitive, advanced Jew has lived his life. But Heller worried about the long-term implications of that division. The, quote, Judaica Jews couldn't tolerate the avant-garde program, he noted, while the, quote, Jewish people who are modern, instead of supporting the Jewish Museum, might back the Whitney Museum or Museum of Modern Art because they did not, quote, want to be too Jewish in their identification. Subsequent exhibits stirred controversies for other reasons. One was a retrospective of paintings by Larry Rivers, of Jewish descent, that included a double portrait of Rivers' mother-in-law in the nude, and another of his wife, also in the nude, both startlingly explicit. A big hullabaloo arose, compounded by what one observer called the strange mixture of the museum's visitors, and I quote, "There are not only the bohemians, the art students who come with paint still wet on their jeans, and the college students, tidier usually, armed with notebooks, and the ladies, young and old, out for an afternoon of picture looking, and the groups from the suburbs or out-of-town tourists. But there are also the elderly Jewish couples pressing on toward the Kiddush cups where they stand lost in reflection, and the serious synagogue sisterhood ladies on tour." The museum inadvertently stoked divisions among those constituencies over avant-garde exhibit openings too. One, for an exhibit of minimalist art, was crowded by about 2,300 merrymakers. Again, there was smoking and drinking throughout, and again, people dressed up or down, a few arriving in outfits crafted especially for the opening. A respite from such controversies was achieved when the museum interspersed its avant-garde shows with exhibits that drew on a new sense of Jewishness not associated with religion or ritual objects. It grew instead out of a return to the Jewish community's Eastern European past. This was nurtured in part by popular books such as A Treasury of Yiddish Stories and a study of shtetls, Life is with People, the Jewish little town in Eastern Europe. A Treasury of Yiddish Stories introduced many Jews to memorable characters, including Sholem Aleichem's Tevye the Dairyman, the archetype of the folksy, pious but irreverent, half-learned but shtetl street smart, proud Eastern European Jew. These subjects were also disseminated by the Eternal Light, including enactments of Aleichem's Tevye stories. It was, however, their distillation into the Broadway musical Fiddler on the Roof that catapulted Jews' Eastern European origins, the shtetl, and Yiddishkeit into American popular culture. Fiddler, which drew adoring sellout crowds, concludes with Tevye's family emigrating to America. They likely would have settled on New York's Lower East Side, where, from the 1870s to the 1920s, thousands of Jews once lived. That history was illuminated in one of the museum's most popular exhibitions, The Lower East Side, Portal to American Life. It included striking photographs, maps, Yiddish theater posters, forgotten recordings, and a short film created for the exhibit featuring Zero Mostel, the actor then playing Tevye in Fiddler. The Lower East Side attracted thousands of visitors, and more than any other exhibit in the museum's history, it appealed to the many segments of the Jewish community, the young and old, the religiously observant and the disaffected, the Jewish bourgeoisie, and the intelligentsia. It was followed a year later by Masada, A Struggle for Freedom, an exhibit on the site, its historical significance, and the archaeological excavations that revealed it. Masada opened in fall 1967, just months, as you well know, after Israel's Six-Day War victory, and it was even more popular than the Lower East Side. These were interspersed with avant-garde shows that were both costly and provocative, the most notable of which was Software, Information Technology, Its New Meaning for Art. Software, skipped a slide again. Well, I'm going to leave it. These were interesting. It filled the museum. So software filled the museum with computer and other electronic equipment, opened to controversy over such works as a recording by African-American activist Eldridge Cleaver, recently accused of anti-Zionist remarks, and continuous loop videos of an artist working, eating, and enjoying sexual intercourse. During a preview for Finkelstein and a Smithsonian official, they were led past that video just as a scene of, quote, the artist in his studio stark naked with two beautiful women was running. Finkelstein stormed out and with his understanding pushed to the breaking point. At the time, the avant-garde exhibits were incurring large deficits that threatened the seminary's finances. Alternatives for reining in the museum's budget included, quote, closing the museum and using it as a warehouse, or, quote, keeping the museum open with the Judaica program only. The latter alternative was appealing because the art world's passion for the avant-garde was waning. Then, too, New York's major modern art museums had stepped up their exhibits of contemporary art, relieving the Jewish Museum of filling that role. As a result, the museum returned to, quote, all Jewish programming in 1971. The director at the time soon resigned. He was replaced with interim management, and the museum was reduced to a skeletal staff and diminished exhibit schedule. The contrast between the museum's tumultuous avant-garde heyday and the tranquility of its all-Jewish turn was so great, some assumed the museum had closed. All this coincided with Finkelstein's retirement. With his departure, the museum lost not only a benevolent advocate, but a thinker whose vision provided much of the avant-garde program's rationale. Over the subsequent decade, the museum's governance ties with the seminary were dissolved, and it became financially independent, though it remains, quote, under the auspices of the seminary to this day. The collectors and others who had helped lead the museum's avant-garde experiment either ceased to promote it or backed away altogether, and the museum's avant-garde experiment concluded. Since then, the Jewish Museum remained true to its all-Jewish commitment. That entailed forays into broader conceptions of what that might mean, but nearly always in the context of Jewish culture. Nonetheless, Stephen Kaiser, Meyer Shapiro, and their contemporaries succeeded in transforming what was once the Museum of Jewish Ceremonial and Historical Objects into a Jewish art museum, even if it wasn't called so. Further, the museum had acquired a taste for continually revisiting such questions as what we mean by Jewish, art, and culture, reflecting a hunger to use the museum to both express and work out mutable Jewish identities for all involved. Here it is important to recall, in the wake of the avant-garde era, that the program's strongest advocates from outside the museum, especially Vera List, Ben Heller, Abram Kanoff, and Shapiro, were self-identifying Jews who prioritized personal relationships with art of all kinds, not only what might qualify as Jewish art, however defined. List's sense of where artistic meaning might be found, moreover, was not limited to Jewish art or the avant-garde, citing, quote, the crucifix or some Christian symbol because of its basic humanitarian content. On a trip to Spain, she saw a painting of Saint Sebastian that deeply affected her. List said, adding, it was, quote, so poignant. It's not Christian. It's mankind and man's inhumanity to man. It doesn't make any difference if it's Moses, Joseph, Saint Sebastian, or who it is. Heller's interests were similarly broad. He was especially interested in South Asian art at the time and thought of viewing it as, quote, a way of our coming to terms with that part of the world and understanding the people who created it as, quote, part of our present existence. He believed the Judaica versus avant-garde disputes reflected divergent aspects of modern Jewry, and that despite differences between the two programs, Heller believed their coexistence expressed in visual terms, quote, conflicting parts of our being that many of us Jews have individually. Although Kanoff much preferred the museum's Judaica programs over the avant-garde, his interpretation of what that might mean was equally wide-ranging. He recalled an exhibit by a young Catholic artist of a series of paintings about Nazism that Kanoff felt could certainly be displayed by the museum. It would be appropriate, even though it was neither by a Jewish artist nor addressed Jews and the Holocaust, because the series treated the, quote, fascist totalitarian aspects of Nazism. The debates over the museum's mission between the opposing groups, represented by List and Kanoff, can be seen as reflecting the ways that during the post-Second World War period, quote, American Jews were profoundly divided over the Jewish aspects of their lives. For a while, the differences between the avant-garde and Judaica advocates were veiled by the extraordinary successes of American Jewry during the era. Despite the Depression, the war, and the Holocaust, the community experienced a golden age from the late 1940s to the late 1960s, marked by prosperity, acceptance, and the triumph of cultural liberalism that was signaled in part by the emergence of a new generation of Jewish collectors. People like List, Heller, Kanoff, and Shapiro exemplified those who embraced both, quote, the dignified idealization of their Jewish origins in bejeweled spice boxes, and yet were sufficiently with it to dig Rauschenberg. While differing in their aims for the museum, they all shared a deep passion for objects of all kinds, respected each other's judgment, and never questioned the Jewishness of those with opposing views. While they entertained expert determinations of what might qualify as Jewish art, in the end, its definition did not matter because they all prioritized the art that was most personally meaningful for them, and by assumed proxy, for their contemporaries among Jews and non-Jews alike. Had the objects at the center of their debates not been so readily marshaled into such starkly different categories, on the one hand, the avant-garde, which included a preponderance of works by non-Jews or that lacked visible Jewish content, and on the other, Jewish ritual artifacts, the debates might not have been so fraught. But that range of objects and the reception among Jews on both sides reflected, as Sylvia Tenenbaum observed in 1966, quote, a sense of dichotomy which the Jewish Museum inherited from the whole of Jewish experience. This brief narrative, while seemingly about Jewish objects and the sites where they were collected and shown, is more accurately about the uses of such objects to navigate Jewish relations with the non-Jewish world. When the objects featured in the Jewish Museum's exhibits expanded from ritual accoutrements and contemporary Jewish art to avant-garde works by non-Jewish artists, art world denizens and the Jewish community took note. But the rationale for the avant-garde shows was not substantially different than it was for the ritual object displays nearly a century prior. Ideally, the public presentation of such works might foster better relations between Jews and the societies in which they live. The various stages in this story correspond to the evolving circumstances of Jewish life in the times and places where Jews dwelled. The beliefs that led the Jewish Museum into the avant-garde were deeply held and urgent for their advocates who, as Jews, felt they were fulfilling Judaism's destiny in modern society. Jewish collectors, curators, and scholars discovered profound meaning in new art, something they wanted to share with the larger public via the Jewish Museum, in part as an expression of Judaism's presumably universal and humanitarian values. That the art had nothing to do with Judaism per se and was often made by non-Jews did not matter. That the Judaica in the museum's collection, or works created by Jewish artists on Jewish topics, were far less meaningful for those collectors and curators than they were for other Jews was, for a time, a troubling but manageable issue. Though the museum subsequently backed away from its once unqualified commitment to the avant-garde, it never entirely moved on from debates over how to balance contemporary art with its treatment of traditional Jewish visual culture, especially its vast collection of ritual objects. The Jewish Museum continues to be haunted by the question of what it ought to display, just as the Jewish community struggles with questions of assimilation, religious solidarity, and ultimately survival. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting and talk and very rich presentation done also visually. So now we are opening the floor if have any questions or comments in the audience? Yes, Miriam, please. I have to.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Abt. This was a fascinating talk and fascinating book. But I have a question. Where would you posit Avram Kampf and his exhibition of Jewish experience in 20th century art in this dichotomy that you presented here?
Well, I talk about it. I talk about that exhibition in the book and at some length, and also the critical response to it, which is fascinating. I didn't address it here, but I think it's important because it triggered a debate about what one means by Jewish art. He explains in the catalog that he's not interested in that question. And so he kind of puts it to the side and wants to focus about what he titles the exhibit, the Jewish experience, and how that might be represented in a variety of different styles and times and so forth. So I wouldn't say that it's not relevant. I would say that in some ways it falls, one might say it either falls outside of, or maybe one could say it's a response, a way of trying to overcome the divisions of the avant-garde era. The exhibit, by the way, comes a few years after the museum turns to all Jewish programming. You know, the decision to make that turn, to drop the avant-garde experiment, is in 1971. And if I recall correctly, I think his exhibit comes in 1975. So in some ways, I treat it almost like a coda, if you will, a way of coming back at that larger question. Did I answer your question?
Oh. Well, yes, but I must admit, in like more on a personal level, that this particular exhibition and actually article that he published afterwards in Jewish of Journal Art actually made me turn towards Jewish art. I thought it was fascinating to see it in that way, that it allows everything and it combines everything. And it's not at the same time, as you said, connected to this crucial question, what the Jewish art is. I think there is so much energy lost on what is Jewish art is, instead of just looking at artworks. And the artworks that he exhibited were fascinating, and maybe not the same group of the New York avant-garde art that you're talking about, but nonetheless, they were avant-garde, from Russian avant-garde to a Paris School of Art, Soutine, Chagall, right? Everybody was there. So without stressing, are they Jewish or do they depict Jewish art? They were just good art, good artists. Lisitsky, Altman, right? They were suddenly all these names that were exhibited at the Jewish Museum. So I don't know. I mean, maybe you stopped with the 60s or you didn't go further. But I think that after that exhibition, museum opened to all kinds of exciting exhibitions. Susan Goodman, she did fantastic shows afterwards, right? With the Soviet art, with Russian art. She was bringing this, what you mentioned, that it was actually sort of Bern, but it's not just shtetl, right? It's not just, it was like really connection to the old world, but the old world that was not a shtetl, but was rather, high level universal art. So, somehow this was missing here, or I felt it's missing.
Well, in the book, I do talk about, but the focus of the book is admittedly from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. I do talk about Kampf's Jewish experience in 20th century art. And I do, in an epilogue to the book, talk about more recent developments. But I guess I should note that I approach the subject from the standpoint of museum history and exhibition history, and how museums in this case, the Jewish Museum, become arenas for other things going on in society. And of course, during that period, it was a moment in which Jewish artists, collectors, scholars, critics were interested in a variety of things, but the Jewish Museum became the place where the newest of the avant-garde was being shown. And it wouldn't, there wouldn't have been the kind of debates that they were if they had, shown, let's say, Jewish avant-garde artists only. But that's not what was happening. They were, showing many other kinds of art. And so that's how it became a question. The question being, of course, ultimately, why is a Jewish museum, a so-called Jewish museum, showing this work? That was the issue. It doesn't, so after the turn to the all-Jewish programming, that doesn't come up again for the most part. There are a couple of shows that are deeply controversial in the museum's history. And also the question of the extent to which the Jewish museum fully dresses Jewish culture in the ways that you were mentioning. I agree with you about the shows, let's say, that were organized by Susan Goodman and Norman Kleeblatt. We could talk about his many wonderful shows. They're really excellent programs. Some of which, by the way, are controversial, of course. Or we could even talk about the display of the permanent collection, where you see this sort of vacillation. There was this great permanent installation called Culture and Continuity, which I think was very satisfying to a lot of people who came to the Jewish Museum. And then that was torn out and replaced by scenes from the collection, which James Snyder, by the way, is right now, as we were speaking, is stripping it all out and replacing it with a show that I think is going to bring it back closer to something more like Culture and Continuity. So I think we see these cycles. One other issue that I think is important to talk about, which I didn't address at all, although we had a wonderful conversation about it at the Jewish Museum. I gave a talk there in February. And this is that the Jewish Museum, being in New York, is a place where there is both a local Jewish community which comes to the museum wanting to see whatever it is that they hope the museum might see. And then there's a large tourist population that comes to the museum. When they come to the museum, tourists coming from around the United States or abroad, they're expecting to learn something about Jewish culture or Jewish history. The name itself obscures its mission in a way. And often those visitors are disappointed because what they're seeing is not necessarily obviously Jewish the way it might be for people who are Jewish art world denizens. It leaves them sort of unsatisfied. And so this is a kind of continuing tension and issue among the curatorial staff and the educational staff and so forth. How do they think about the programming and how do they think about interpreting the program in a way that visitors who are coming in from the outside might enjoy and appreciate? So your observations are well taken. I think probably we're thinking about them a little differently because on my viewpoint is through how museums function and how they become, in a sense, barometers of what's going on in culture and society.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please, Richard. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And valuable. And I'm wondering about one word which did not appear throughout your presentation today, and that is the word Israel. And I wonder, when you think about it in terms of the context of the period that you've discussed and until the beginning of the 1970s, except for the one exhibition that you mentioned, Israel is not part of the scene. And I wonder when do you think this began to change? Did it only begin to change after 67? Or was there something in the period from 1948 to 1967 that was in some way important to the Jewish Museum?
Oh, that's a great question. There are occasional shows of work by Israeli artists. Throughout this period, they're not common And that may have been more an economic question than a question of interest. I just don't know. I don't recall any conversations, any sustained discussions about the amount of attention the museum ought to be giving to Israel. So I think that was much more a matter of curatorial opportunity and interest, maybe the occasional collector. I just don't know. They're not many shows, and they do tend to be group shows or either group shows of Israeli artists or maybe an occasional solo show. I'd have to go back through and look at the list of exhibitions. I don't, and I should say, there's a larger question. There's a larger question, I think, implicit in that, there, and that is, what is the relationship between the New York Jewish community and Israel in a broader sense? What were people thinking about? What were they currently concerning themselves with? That's a really excellent question, and I do not know the answer to that. It's a very good question. As we've talked about, you and I've talked about privately, and one could come back to that. I don't think Israel, my sense is that just in terms of popular American consciousness, which certainly would have affected the American Jewish community from a different angle, is that the 6-Day War was transformative. That both the run-up to the war and the outcome of the war, I think, had a huge impact, both among American Jews and in American popular culture more generally. So there is a turning point there. But Masada was planned long before, and that was kind of came about by circumstance, really. So that it was a coincidence that the exhibition, which had appeared first in London, and was really the outcome of work by Yigdal Yadin and his various projects and promotions and so forth. So the fact that it ended up in New York in the fall of 1967 is really a coincidence, not, I think, necessarily a significant outcome. Although maybe one could read it differently. I'm not sure. I don't want to be too definitive about that. Excellent question, though.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, please, Shir.
Thank you, Professor Abd. This was a wonderful talk, and I've also read your book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and we can talk about it at another time, hopefully. And Richard, I wanted to follow up on your question because I have a whole list of questions, which I will not address all of them. But just to follow up quickly on Richard's wonderful question and comment, which was something I also wanted to ask you about, so thank you. There is clearly a relationship of some kind of a relationship between Israel and the Jewish Museum, or at least the Israel Museum and the Jewish Museum, because when we think about 1968, the year that Katz leaves the Israel Museum, he leaves the Israel Museum in order to start his position as director of the Jewish Museum. And we see this happening, well, for instance, now with James Snyder. And I think it's a very interesting question and something to think about. And separately, we also see this in terms of the relationships between Jewish artists and Jewish modern Judaica artists working in Israel and coming to work at the workshop that kind of sets up in the basement at the Jewish Museum. So there is definitely a relationship there that needs to be investigated. But my other question is a little different for you, Professor Abd, and I don't know if you really had an opportunity to expand on this subject matter, so maybe it's just a thought, and maybe we can discuss this in the future. But a couple of years ago, there was the exhibition at the Jewish Museum that displayed, after many, many years, the Jewish cultural reconstruction objects that arrived in the 1950s. And I was wondering if you were able to find or you have any thoughts on the reasons that they were not displayed. They were kind of kept away since the 1950s and until much later on. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you were able to share with us about what, the way that these objects were seen, were perceived at the time and later on throughout the process until, well, the 2020. or 2022 actually. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Well, there's quite a bit of material about the Jewish cultural reconstruction in the archives. And I should mention, by the way, for anybody who would like to do further research on the Jewish Museum, the vast majority of the archival material about the museum, really up through the 1970s at least, are actually at the Jewish Theological Seminary. That's the place where one finds most of the material about the museum. The Jewish Museum's own archives are relatively small and not very accessible or well organized. And they only really they only become indispensable sometime in the 1970s. With regard to the Jewish cultural reconstruction, and one could even go back to the Danzig collection, which was given to the museum and then became part of its permanent collection, or loaned to the museum and then became part of the permanent collection. I think that lack of display, in fairness to the Jewish Museum's curators, is that the display of ritual objects in particular is a hard sell. The curators find them just hard to display and generate public interest. So finding ways to do that has always been a challenging proposition. And I see that evidence of that starting already in the 1930s, before the museum even moves to the Warburg Mansion. So I think that probably has a little bit more to do with it. I think the kinds of typological arrays like we saw from that photo I showed from the London Anglo-Jewish exhibition, that kind of presentation, it's very hard to sell that today. And the Jewish Museum has tried a couple of different approaches in more recent times during the scenes for collection era. And their images of, now that the display is gone, there's still photos available through the public relations news releases, media kits that are at the Jewish Museum. You can see what those displays look like. One approach that they tried to do is aggregate Jewish ritual objects with other kinds of Judaica and present them as in a cabinet of curiosity sort of setting, which of course many people found demeaning and completely mystifying. Another approach is one that James Snyder is pursuing, which is there's going to be a kind of glass wall or case. It's going to be huge. That's going to contain dozens, maybe hundreds of Chanukia. And it's going to be on the theme of light in Jewish religion and culture, and using it as a kind of educational point of departure for their education program. So you see sort of these, one sees curators struggling for ways to present this material in a way that's going to serve both as a kind of public draw and be interesting, visually interesting and informative. But I don't think as a question of how the collection was developed and so forth. The museum has really never done much with that, I would say, throughout its collecting history, actually.
Yes, Miriam, please. We don't hear you, Miriam.
Yeah, sorry. No, it's okay. I just have one specific question. When you were going through the material of Theological Seminary, before it was moved to the building, did you come across any exhibitions of paintings done by East European Polish artists, Polish Jewish artists, like for instance, that they have now? Minkowski was used to have been in the old, not the renewed exhibition, but before that it was hanging in a permanent exhibition, or Hirschenberg. Did you see them exhibited on the photographs also in the Jewish Theological Seminary?
You mean before the museum moved in 1944?
Yeah.
The records are not great, and I do not recall. And I should say the records of the exhibitions that they mounted during that period were not very extensive. They're kind of scattered, and one has to put that information together by looking at the seminary's annual reports. The curator at the time, Paul Romanoff, would submit reports to, well, he was under the supervision of Alexander Marx, who was the head librarian at that time. So he would submit reports, and reports on what happened in the museum would be included in the library's annual report. I don't recall off the top of my head, and there's not a good calendar of exhibitions for the Jewish Museum until 1944, or so I should say 1947, excuse me, when the people at the Warburg Mansion begin to start compiling a comprehensive list.
I see.
So I wish I could answer your question off the top of my head. I can look. I'll tell you what. If you want to send me an email note.
Yes, I would very much like to continue this with the emails, because I was just also now in February. I was before your talk, so I wasn't there. But I was actually looking for works from Minkowski, Maurycy Minkowski, and he was he was brought to New York in '39 with the Benjamin Mintz and Rose Mintz collection, and they had additional paintings. So I was wondering if those paintings, I mean, everybody knows about their Judaica collection, much less about the paintings that they brought. So I was wondering if you came across any photographs or pictures of these paintings being exhibited or anything similar.
No, there are, if I remember correctly, relatively extensive files on the Mintz collection, correspondence, and on that acquisition. I don't think there are any photographs in those files at all, but I do believe there are some lists of materials.
And that's also JTS.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Virtually any question you have about the museum, I would say prior to about 1970, you're better off looking in the Jewish Theological Seminary records. And I'd be happy to tell you, because there are pockets of material that are, there's a section of material on the Jewish Museum, but then there are pockets of material in other parts of the archives. And depending on who you speak with in the archives, they may be aware of it or not, but I can point you to finding aids and places that you might find material otherwise.
I will be happy to continue on emails. I will be happy to write you.
Yeah, be glad to help.
Thank
you. Okay, so do we have any other questions or comments? If not, so thank you very much again, Jeffrey. It was a wonderful talk. And next week, same day, same time, we have a very interesting lecture by Noah Avram Barak, and she will talk about Israeli art. So see you next week. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.